The scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass was the perfume of my perfect mornings in Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. My name is Lena Carmichael, and at 32 years old, I'd cultivated a life here that felt, finally, like a sanctuary. My small but meticulously maintained home was more than just a house. It was a testament to order, to peace, to the quiet triumph of building something beautiful out of chaos. Every rose bush pruned, every flagstone walkway swept, every antique piece of furniture polished to a gleam, these were not just chores, but rituals that grounded me, reflecting the very core of my being. Resolute, meticulous, morally driven. I valued tranquility above almost all else, a serenity hard-won after years of navigating turbulent waters. My family, though loved dearly, had seen their share of struggles, particularly with predatory individuals who preyed on vulnerabilities and the insidious tendrils of drug-related exploitation. I had witnessed firsthand the devastating toll it took, the way it stripped dignity and shattered lives. Because of that, I carried a quiet, fierce determination within me, a deep-seated aversion to injustice, especially when it involved the exploitation of the weak. I was, in my own way, a determined vigilante, targeting those who sought to exploit, to dismantle the networks profiting from such vulnerabilities. Willow Creek was supposed to be my haven, a place where that vigilance could finally rest. Then came the old man next door. His name was Arthur. He lived in a house that seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns and cheerful flower beds that lined our street. At first, Arthur was just a quirky neighbor, prone to puttering in his overgrown yard at odd hours. His car, a battered, faded sedan, occasionally seemed to drift a little too close to the property line, but I dismissed it as an old man's slight miscalculation. My peace was too precious to be disturbed by such minor infractions. The first real breach occurred on a Tuesday afternoon, a day as bright and unassuming as any other. I was in my garden, humming along to an old folk song when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel, but it wasn't gravel. It was the tender sod of my newly laid lawn. I looked up, startled, to see Arthur's sedan cutting a diagonal path straight through the corner of my yard, leaving deep, ugly ruts in its wake. He drove slowly, deliberately, as if this were an established shortcut, a part of his everyday route. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, jarring chord of disbelief and something akin to violation. My serene world had just been abruptly, rudely interrupted. He stopped momentarily at the edge of his own driveway, glanced my way, and offered a vague, almost toothless smile before disappearing into his dilapidated garage. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my gardening gloves still clutched in my hand, staring at the fresh scars on my lawn. It wasn't just the damage, it was the audacity, the casual disregard for my property, my space, my effort. A flicker of that old, familiar fire, the one that burned against injustice, ignited deep within me. This wasn't just an old man making a mistake. This felt like a deliberate claim. My initial reaction, in line with my morally driven nature, was to seek a polite, rational solution. I waited an hour, letting my initial surge of anger dissipate, replacing it with a reasoned approach. I walked over to his house, notepad and pen in hand, meticulously prepared. I knocked on his front door, a flimsy, peeling thing that looked like it had survived a war. No answer. I tried again, louder this time, still nothing. I walked around to the back, peering into his chaotic yard, calling his name gently. He was nowhere to be seen. Frustration began to bubble. My resolve stiffened. I decided to leave a carefully worded note, polite but firm, explaining the damage and requesting that he cease driving on my property. I even offered to help him turn his car around if he found it difficult. I taped it securely to his front door, convinced that clear communication would resolve the issue. I returned to my house, the image of those tire tracks searing into my mind. I was prepared for peace, but also for persistence. The next morning, the note was gone. The ruts, however, remained. I watched from my kitchen window as Arthur pulled out of his driveway. My breath caught in my throat. He did it again. Not just through the same corner, but a wider, more pronounced arc, as if to emphasize his ownership of the path. This wasn't an accident. This was a challenge. And in Willow Creek, where I had built my refuge, a challenge like this felt like a direct assault on my carefully constructed peace. My meticulous nature immediately shifted from maintaining order to documenting disorder. I knew then that this wasn't going to be easy, and I understood, with a sinking feeling, that my quiet vigilance would be called upon once more. I invested in a set of high-definition security cameras, positioning them strategically to cover every inch of my property line, particularly the contested corner. This wasn't a casual decision. It was a deliberate, methodical step, typical of my meticulous approach to any problem. I researched the best models, read countless reviews, and spent an entire Saturday painstakingly installing them, running wires and testing angles until every pixel of my property was under watchful digital eyes. The sight of the blinking red lights on the cameras gave me a strange, paradoxical sense of both unease and empowerment. I was preparing for a battle I hadn't asked for, but one I was determined to win. The camera footage, when it began to accumulate, was damning. Arthur, day after day, sometimes multiple times a day, continued his casual invasions. He'd drive over my lawn, sometimes parking half on my grass while he retrieved mail, other times simply cutting the corner to save a few seconds on his drive. My righteous indignation simmered beneath the surface of my calm exterior. My resolve hardened. This was no longer just about ruts in the lawn. It was about a fundamental disrespect, a flagrant disregard for boundaries that I, as a morally driven individual, found utterly unacceptable. After a week of documented offenses, I made the call to the Willow Creek Police Department. The dispatcher listened patiently, a hint of weary resignation in her voice, no doubt accustomed to the petty squabbles of suburban life. I explained everything with the precision of a lawyer, dates, times, descriptions of the vehicle, and the nature of the damage. I omitted no detail. This was my meticulousness at work, building an undeniable case. An officer, a young man named Officer Miller, arrived a short while later. He listened attentively as I recounted the tale, his gaze occasionally drifting to the fresh tire tracks still marring my lawn. I showed him the camera footage, clips of Arthur's car cruising effortlessly over my property. Officer Miller nodded, his expression shifting from detached professionalism to a slight frown. "Clear as day, ma'am," he stated, his voice calm but firm. "This is blatant trespassing." He walked over to Arthur's house, and I watched from my porch, a nervous knot in my stomach. A sense of anticipation, mixed with a sliver of trepidation, settled over me. What would happen now? Arthur, surprisingly, answered the door. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw Officer Miller gesturing towards my property, then pointing a finger directly at Arthur, his body language conveying a stern warning. Arthur looked bewildered, then indignant. He waved his hands dismissively, his frail frame seeming to shrink under the officer's gaze. After a few minutes, Officer Miller returned to my side. "He claims he didn't realize he was driving on your property, ma'am. Says he's always cut that corner." He paused, a wry twist to his lips. I explained in no uncertain terms that he is now officially trespassed from your property. Any further instances of him setting foot or tire on your land, and he'll be subject to immediate arrest for criminal trespass. A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a sense of vindication. Finally, the wheels of justice were turning. "Thank you, officer," I said, genuinely grateful. He nodded, gave a polite salute, and drove off. I watched Arthur's house for the rest of the day, a new vigilance in my gaze. The intrusions stopped. For a few days, peace returned, a fragile, hard-won peace. I almost dared to hope that the nightmare was over, that my carefully constructed sanctuary was safe once more. I had gotten what I wanted, a clear boundary enforced, but my gut, honed by years of navigating convoluted situations, told me this was merely an intermission. The true test of my resolve, the full activation of my morally driven spirit, was yet to come. The initial problem was solved, but the deeper question remained. What truly motivated Arthur? What was truly going on in that house next door? Subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily. The silence from Arthur's property lasted for just under 2 weeks. 2 weeks of uninterrupted tranquility, of mornings filled with birdsong rather than the grinding of tires on my lawn. I began to relax, to let down my guard, convincing myself that the officer's stern warning had truly sunk in. My routine, so meticulously crafted, slid back into place. I tended my garden, worked from my home office, and enjoyed quiet evenings on my porch reading. It was a blissful, if temporary, reprieve. Then came the old television set. It was a Saturday morning, bright and early, when I stepped out to gather the newspaper. My gaze drifted towards the edge of my backyard, where my property met a dense thicket of trees and brush that defined the boundary with Arthur's neglected land. And there it was. A monstrous cathode ray tube television, easily 27 inches across, its screen cracked, its plastic casing yellowed with age, half hidden among the wild growth. It was unmistakably dumped. Not placed, not accidentally dropped, but dumped. And it was on my property. My jaw tightened. This was beyond a simple lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, malicious, and a blatant act of disrespect, a clear violation of the trespass warning. My meticulous nature immediately kicked in. I grabbed my phone, snapped several high-resolution photos, zooming in on the distinct brand of the television, the specific cracked patterns, and its exact placement relative to my property markers. This was not just about the television, it was about the principle. It was about proving, once again, that Arthur felt entitled to use my land as his personal dumping ground. The anger that flared within me was cold, precise. This wasn't the chaotic rage of previous years, but a focused fury, sharpened by my experiences. I saw the old man's actions not just as a neighborly nuisance, but as a symptom, a visible sign of a deeper neglect, or perhaps even a calculated exploitation. My motivation, the one born from witnessing my own family members fall victim to predatory individuals, began to stir. I vowed to uncover what was truly happening, to dismantle whatever network might be preying on an old, seemingly vulnerable man. This was a direct assault on the very values I held dear. I called the police again, detailing the new trespass, the illegal dumping, the blatant disregard for their previous warning. Officer Miller, to my surprise, answered the call himself. "Ms. Carmichael," he greeted, a hint of recognition in his voice. "Back to Arthur, are we?" "Unfortunately, officer," I replied, keeping my voice level resolute. "He's dumped a large television in my woods on my property. It's a clear violation of the trespass order." He sighed, a sound that spoke volumes about the frustrations of his job. "All right, I'll head over there now, see what's going on." The confrontation that followed was, once again, out of my earshot, but the visual cues were clear enough. I saw Officer Miller stand at Arthur's door for a long time, knocking loudly. Finally, Arthur emerged, looking disheveled, his eyes darting nervously. The officer pointed towards my property, then at the thicket. Arthur's face crumpled into a mask of feigned innocence, then disbelief. The conversation was animated, culminating in Officer Miller clearly stating something that caused Arthur to slump, defeated. Officer Miller returned to my side. "He admits to putting it there, Ms. Carmichael," he stated, his voice flat. "Says he thought it was abandoned land and was doing you a favor by cleaning it up." He rolled his eyes. I reminded him that he's not permitted on your property for any reason, and that includes cleaning it up. I've told him he has 24 hours to remove the television, or he'll face charges for illegal dumping and contempt of a trespass order. Another small victory, another brief reprieve. But this time I felt no relief, only a deepening sense of unease. Arthur's behavior wasn't just erratic, it was almost childlike in its defiance, yet simultaneously cunning. There was something off, something systemic, something that spoke to more than just an old man's stubbornness. It felt like he was being used, or that his faculties were severely compromised, making him a pawn in a larger game. The next morning, the television was gone. I checked my cameras. The footage showed Arthur, struggling, heaving the bulky TV through the woods, a difficult, painful process for a man of his age and apparent physical state. He didn't put it on the curb for trash collection or anywhere visible. He just made it disappear. The efficiency of its removal, almost too quick for a man who seemed so frail, raised another question in my mind. Who helped him, or was he truly alone, pushed to this by some unseen force? My meticulous mind started piecing together the subtle clues. The occasional strange cars, the furtive figures I sometimes glimpsed moving in and out of Arthur's house at odd hours, the air of disarray that seemed to deepen around his property. My role as a determined vigilante, targeting exploiters, began to solidify. It was 2 days later when the note appeared. I found it taped to my front door, a piece of flimsy paper scrawled with shaky, almost illegible handwriting. It read, "Regarding the tree on your property dropping leaves and twigs in my yard. If you do not take care of this by June 1st, I will be filing a civil suit against you for damages and inconvenience." It was dated 2 days prior, meaning I had precisely 6 days to comply. My initial reaction was a bitter laugh. A tree? My majestic oak, which had stood on my property for decades, dropping leaves? This was it. This was Arthur's grand countermove, his bluff. The sheer ridiculousness of it was almost comical, but the underlying malice was chilling. He was angry about being caught, about being forced to remove his trash. He was lashing out, attempting to intimidate me. This was the moment I realized this was not just a neighborly dispute anymore. This was a war of wills, and Arthur, or someone behind him, was trying to break me. My resolve, however, was unbreakable. I had faced far greater challenges. My meticulous nature immediately shifted to research. I consulted property laws, local ordinances, and even spoke to a retired lawyer friend. Every source confirmed what I instinctively knew. I was not responsible for leaves or twigs naturally falling from my tree onto his property. This was pure bluster, a desperate attempt to regain control. My morally driven core rejected the manipulation, strengthening my resolve to stand firm. I would not be intimidated. I would not yield. The days crawled by, each one bringing the June 1st deadline closer. I did nothing about the tree. My cameras continued to record, a silent, unblinking witness to Arthur's continued presence next door. The tension in the air was palpable, even if unspoken. It was like living on the edge of a dormant volcano, waiting for the inevitable eruption. I found myself checking my mail obsessively, expecting official-looking envelopes, legal papers. Nothing came. Arthur avoided eye contact whenever our paths briefly crossed. The standoff continued, a silent battle of wills waged across a property line. My determination to find out what was truly going on in that house, and to protect not only myself, but potentially Arthur from whatever forces were at play, solidified into an unwavering purpose. It was June 3rd, 2 days past Arthur's arbitrary deadline, and I still hadn't heard a single word from him or anyone on his behalf regarding the supposed lawsuit. No threatening letters, no court summons, no angry knocks on the door. It was just as I, with my methodical approach to anticipating outcomes, had suspected. All bark, no bite. He had been mad about being caught, about being forced to remove his illegally dumped television, and he tried to intimidate me into backing off. But intimidation wasn't something I succumbed to easily, not after everything I had seen and faced. My resolute spirit remained unbent. The absence of a lawsuit was a small victory, a tiny mini payoff in the grand scheme of things, confirming my assessment of Arthur's bluster. But this temporary truce didn't bring the peace I yearned for. Instead, it deepened my unease. My finely tuned moral compass, constantly calibrated by past traumas, kept pointing towards Arthur's deteriorating state and the shadowy figures I occasionally glimpsed at his house. The physical effort Arthur had displayed in removing the heavy television, coupled with his disheveled appearance and the strange, almost childlike defiance, screamed out to me. He wasn't just a nuisance. He was a potential victim, and this new realization tapped directly into the wellspring of my core motivation. I found myself observing Arthur more closely, my meticulous nature now focused on gathering information not just for my own protection, but for his. I saw him struggle with simple tasks, climbing the 2 steps to his own porch, his gait unsteady, his hands trembling. One day I watched dumbfounded as he chased a squirrel, riding his ancient lawnmower, directly into my yard, veering wildly, his eyes wide and unfocused. It was a bizarre, almost comical sight, but it sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just an eccentric old man. This was a man whose mental and physical faculties were clearly in steep decline. And who was benefiting from this decline? The question echoed in my mind, compelling me forward. My friend, a reliable and discreet source within the Willow Creek Police Department, the same one who had provided the names of the individuals living with Arthur, became a vital contact. I reached out to him, casually at first, then with increasing urgency, detailing my observations of Arthur's declining state, my growing suspicions about the people living in his house. He listened patiently, then confirmed my worst fears with a grave tone. "Lena," he began, his voice low, "there's been activity at Arthur's place. We've had a few calls, and well, let's just say there was a raid recently. Temporary arrests were made for dealing crack cocaine out of his house." My blood ran cold. Crack. Exploitation. The words reverberated with a familiar, chilling echo from my past. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute. This was exactly the kind of predatory network I was driven to dismantle. My resolute and morally driven nature surged to the forefront. Arthur was clearly being exploited, his home turned into a drug den, his vulnerability capitalized upon. The personal affront of the trespass and the TV dumping suddenly paled in comparison to the insidious evil unfolding next door. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about justice, about protecting the vulnerable, about fulfilling my role as a determined vigilante against exploiters. My emotional arc shifted from frustration to outrage, then to a steely, unwavering resolve. I immediately knew what I had to do. My meticulous nature demanded a thorough approach. I compiled every piece of evidence I had: the dates and times of every trespass, the photos of the dumped TV, the footage of Arthur struggling on his porch steps, the bizarre squirrel incident, the dates of the police visits, and now, armed with the knowledge of the drug raid and the names of the individuals involved, a clearer picture of the sinister forces at play. This was my personal crusade, fueled by a deeply personal history. Acting on a suggestion I had seen in an online forum, a suggestion that resonated deeply with my moral convictions, I made an appointment at Willow Creek's local human services building, specifically seeking out the Office of Aging. This was our community's version of adult protective services, a place where the vulnerable could potentially find help. My heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. This felt like the right path, the truly effective way to address the systemic neglect I perceived. The woman I met at the Office of Aging, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Evans, listened with a calm professionalism that was both reassuring and slightly detached. I spent an entire hour in her office, recounting the entire sordid saga, leaving no detail out. My meticulous preparation shone through as I laid out the timeline of events, the escalating nuisances, Arthur's declining state, the shadowy figures, and finally, the confirmed drug activity. I showed her the footage of Arthur struggling on his porch, a visceral testament to his physical decline. I described the incident with the lawnmower and the squirrel, painting a stark picture of his mental state. And then I presented the most damning evidence of all: the footage I had from the raid on his house, the brief, unsettling images of the police presence, and the names of the individuals arrested, confirmed by my friend in the police department. "I believe Mr. Arthur is being exploited, Ms. Evans," I stated, my voice firm, unwavering. "His home is being used for illegal activities, and his vulnerability is being taken advantage of. I've seen this before, and it rarely ends well." My words carried the weight of my past experiences, a plea born of deeply held moral convictions. Ms. Evans nodded slowly, her expression now etched with concern. She reviewed the documents, watched the video clips. "This is a very comprehensive report, Ms. Carmichael," she said, her voice gentle. "We'll submit this to our investigation unit immediately. They'll assess the situation and determine the appropriate course of action." A flicker of hope ignited within me. "Will I be updated?" I asked, desperate for some assurance. She offered a sympathetic smile. "Typically, we don't provide updates on ongoing investigations to the reporting party, Ms. Carmichael, to protect the privacy of the individual involved. You'll only hear from us if our investigators require further information from you." The words hung in the air, deflating my fragile hope. No updates. Only time would tell. I walked out of that office feeling a profound sense of exhaustion, a heavy weight pressing down on my shoulders. I had poured out my heart, presented every meticulously gathered piece of evidence, and yet I was left in limbo. The exploiters, though temporarily arrested, could still return. Arthur, vulnerable and clearly unwell, was still in that house, a ticking time bomb of neglect and abuse. This was my rock bottom, a moment of profound helplessness where my resolve felt tested to its very limits. I had done everything by the book, exhausted every official channel, yet the pervasive sense of dread remained. The system felt slow, almost indifferent to the urgent human tragedy unfolding next door. I felt a surge of intense anger, not just at Arthur, but at the systemic failures that allowed such vulnerability to be exploited, mirroring the frustrations I had felt watching my own family suffer. My desire for justice, for a true dismantling of this network, was stronger than ever, but the path forward felt agonizingly unclear. The weight was unbearable. Subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily. The days following my detailed report to the Office of Aging stretched into an agonizing eternity. Each sunrise brought with it a renewed sense of anticipation, quickly replaced by the familiar ache of uncertainty. I found myself watching Arthur's house with an even sharper eye, every passing vehicle, every fleeting shadow, a potential sign of change, a clue that my carefully laid groundwork was finally yielding results. But Willow Creek remained outwardly calm, its serene facade hiding the rot I knew festered beneath. My meticulous planning, my exhaustive efforts, seemed to have vanished into a bureaucratic void. This protracted silence was its own form of torture, pushing me further into that dark pit of helplessness. Yet deep within me, the embers of my resolute spirit refused to die. My moral compass, though spinning wildly in the face of inaction, still pointed towards justice. My frustration, rather than consuming me, began to coalesce into a new, more determined resolve. If the official channels were slow, then I would simply have to be faster, smarter, more persistent. My role as a determined vigilante targeting exploiters was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a calling, fueled by the vivid echoes of my family's past struggles. The rock bottom I had hit was not a stopping point, but a launch pad. I began to expand my vigilant efforts, quietly and discreetly. My security cameras continued their silent watch, but now I was reviewing the footage with a more discerning eye, searching for patterns, for connections, for any new faces or vehicles associated with Arthur's house. I documented license plates, noted times, and cross-referenced them with local news reports, looking for any mention of drug-related arrests or activities that might link back to Arthur's known associates. My police friend, though unable to provide ongoing updates on the Human Services investigation, subtly fed me tidbits of information about known drug circles in the area, allowing me to build a more comprehensive picture of the network I was determined to dismantle. I also began to engage in subtle, yet strategic, conversations with other longtime residents of Willow Creek. Not gossip, but carefully phrased questions about the changes they'd observed in the neighborhood, the quality of life, any concerns they might have. My moral drive compelled me to seek out others who might also be disturbed by the situation, to subtly build a collective awareness without directly exposing Arthur or jeopardizing the ongoing, albeit slow, official process. I learned that many neighbors shared my unease about the constant stream of strange visitors to Arthur's house, the neglected state of his property, and the increasingly erratic behavior of the old man himself. A silent, shared understanding began to form, a communal anxiety that simmered beneath the surface of our quiet suburban lives. One afternoon, almost a month after my report to the Office of Aging, I saw a familiar car pull up to Arthur's house. It was a vehicle I recognized from the police raid footage, a dark, nondescript sedan belonging to one of the individuals who had been temporarily arrested for crack dealing. My heart pounded. They were back. The exploiters, undeterred, were resuming their predatory activities. My resolve solidified into an unyielding steel. This was precisely why I couldn't afford to wait. This was why I had to act. My meticulous planning shifted into high gear. I couldn't directly confront drug dealers, nor was it my place to conduct a personal sting operation. My strength lay in documentation, in leveraging the system, and in strategic pressure. I compiled all my new observations, the vehicle descriptions, the dates and times, new footage of suspicious activity. I created a concise, undeniable dossier of continued exploitation. This wasn't just about Arthur's nuisance anymore. It was about the insidious spread of a criminal enterprise directly impinging on our community's safety and well-being. I decided on a multi-pronged approach, knowing that persistence and comprehensive evidence were key. First, I would reach out to the police again, providing the updated information on the returned individuals, pushing for renewed vigilance. Second, and crucially, I would follow up with the Office of Aging, not asking for updates, but providing them with new, compelling evidence that the situation was escalating, emphasizing the continued exploitation of Arthur. I would frame it as a matter of increasing urgency, stressing the potential for harm to Arthur and the broader community. The phone call to Officer Miller was direct and to the point. "Officer, I need to report continued illegal activity at Arthur's residence. The individuals who were previously arrested for drug dealing have returned, and I have fresh documentation of their presence." He listened, his tone shifting from casual to serious. He promised to increase patrols and to look into getting a new warrant, but stressed the legal complexities. It was a small step, but a vital one. My visit to the Human Services building for the second time, however, was where I poured all my energy. I walked into Ms. Evans's office, the thick folder of new evidence clutched in my hand, my expression resolute. "Ms. Evans," I began, without preamble, "I understand you can't provide updates, but I feel it is my moral obligation to provide you with new information regarding Arthur's situation. The individuals exploiting him have returned." I meticulously laid out the new evidence. The license plates, the dates and times of their suspicious comings and goings, the subtle changes in Arthur's demeanor that hinted at increased stress or fear. I highlighted how this resurgence of activity pointed to a deep-seated, systemic issue that went beyond simple neglect. I spoke passionately about the vulnerability of the elderly, about the way predatory individuals target those who cannot defend themselves, drawing on the raw, authentic emotions of my past experiences. I explained my motivation in clear terms, how seeing Arthur's predicament mirrored the pain my own family had endured. Ms. Evans listened, her initial calm facade slowly cracking. Her eyes, which had seemed so detached before, now held a glint of genuine concern. She flipped through the new photos, scanned the timestamps, her jaw tightening. "Ms. Carmichael," she said, her voice low, "this is extremely concerning. Your continued vigilance and meticulous documentation are invaluable. This certainly adds urgency to the ongoing investigation." She couldn't promise anything, of course, not directly, but I saw the shift in her demeanor, the deepening commitment in her eyes. I knew, with a certainty that transcended mere hope, that my continuous pressure, my unyielding focus on the details, was finally piercing through the bureaucratic layers. I had given them what they needed: undeniable proof that the problem wasn't resolving itself, that the exploiters were persistent, and that Arthur's welfare was still gravely at risk. The grand payoff, when it came, wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a sudden, explosive victory. It was a quiet, steady unraveling, a testament to the persistent pressure of my meticulous, morally driven efforts. It started subtly. First, the strange cars began to appear less frequently at Arthur's house. Then, the figures I had grown accustomed to seeing slinking in and out vanished entirely. A palpable shift occurred in the air around his property, a subtle easing of the oppressive tension that had hung over it for months. My cameras, ever watchful, confirmed the diminishing activity. The exploiters, it seemed, had finally been driven out or perhaps moved on, finding easier targets. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a different kind of vehicle pulled up to Arthur's house. It wasn't a police cruiser or a familiar beat-up sedan. It was a clean, white van, clearly marked with the logo of a local elder care service. Two individuals, a man and a woman in professional uniforms, entered Arthur's house. They stayed for several hours. The next day, the van returned, accompanied by a social worker. Over the course of the following week, more visits occurred, each one lasting longer, signaling a profound change. My police friend, always discreet, finally confirmed what I suspected. "Lena," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with a quiet satisfaction, "your reports, especially that last, comprehensive one to the Office of Aging, were the tipping point. They initiated a full intervention. It was a complicated situation, but they've confirmed Arthur's severe mental decline and vulnerability. They're moving him to an assisted living facility where he can receive proper care." A wave of profound relief, mixed with a deep sense of vindication, washed over me. It wasn't the dramatic arrest of a villain, but a quiet, compassionate victory. Arthur, despite his past aggressions, was no longer a pawn in a predatory game. He was getting the help he needed, and the network that had exploited him, using his home as a base for their illicit activities, was truly dismantled. My motivation, born from personal trauma, had finally found its true, restorative purpose. This was emotional state Z, triumph, satisfaction, profound peace. The day Arthur moved out was quiet, almost anticlimactic. The white van returned, along with a few family members I had never seen before, looking somber and perhaps a little regretful. Arthur, frail and confused, was gently escorted from his house, a small suitcase clutched in his trembling hand. He didn't look my way. He didn't wave. He simply got into the van and then he was gone. His house, once a source of constant stress and unsettling mystery, stood empty, finally silent. The immediate consequences for me were profound. The constant hum of anxiety that had lived beneath my skin for months dissipated. My home, my sanctuary, truly felt like a sanctuary again. I could garden without scanning the horizon for tire tracks. I could sleep without listening for the muffled sounds of late-night visitors next door. The mental and emotional toll of living next to hell had been immense, subtle but pervasive, affecting my focus, my sleep, even my ability to truly relax. Now, that burden was lifted. The peace I had longed for, the one I had meticulously fought to restore, was finally mine. The long-term consequences, however, extended beyond my personal tranquility. Arthur's house stood empty for a few months, a stark reminder of the battle I had waged. Then, new life stirred. Contractors arrived, renovating the dilapidated structure. Fresh paint, new windows, a manicured lawn slowly transformed the property. A young family with two small children eventually moved in, their laughter and innocent chatter replacing the unsettling silence that had once hung heavy in the air. The neighborhood, too, seemed to collectively exhale. A quiet camaraderie settled among us, a shared understanding that justice, though slow and arduous, had ultimately prevailed. My experience with Arthur solidified my understanding of my own nature. My resolute spirit, my meticulous approach to problems, and my deeply ingrained moral compass were not just personal traits, they were tools for justice. I had started out simply wanting to protect my property, but I had ended up dismantling a small piece of the systemic exploitation that had once scarred my own family. I wasn't a superhero, but I was a determined vigilante, and in Willow Creek, I had proven that one person's unwavering commitment could make a profound difference. The final twist came unexpectedly, months later. My police friend, sharing a cup of coffee with me one afternoon, leaned in conspiratorially. "Remember those individuals at Arthur's house?" he asked, his voice low. "The ones dealing crack? Your detailed reports, Lena, especially that last one, connected them to a larger network operating across the county. Your information was instrumental in a much wider bust. You didn't just clear out a single house, you helped take down a significant piece of their operation." A shockwave of realization went through me. My actions, seemingly small in their immediate scope, had rippled outwards, achieving a far greater impact than I could have imagined. My meticulous documentation, my relentless follow-ups, my unwavering moral drive, it had all culminated in a justice that was both personal and far-reaching. The exploitation I had fought so hard against, the kind that had once preyed on my own kin, had truly been dismantled, at least in this corner of the world. And in that moment, a quiet satisfaction settled within my soul, a profound sense of purpose fulfilled. Willow Creek was safe, and I had helped make it so. Subscribe to Neighbours From Hell channel for new Neighbours From Hell stories daily.